The phone rang at 2:17 a.m., jolting me awake. Xavier Blackwood's voice cut through the darkness, high-pitched with panic. "David, what the hell is Clause 17? My lawyers are telling me some insane story about patents reverting to a fired employee." I sat up in bed, instantly alert. After 5 years of waiting, the trap had finally sprung. "You should have read your contracts before you signed them, Xavier." "Don't give me legal bullshit. Fix this, now." I walked to my home office, flicking on the lights. On my desk sat a red folder I'd hoped never to open, labeled VERTEC, Emergency Protocols. Inside were copies of every document, every email, every piece of evidence that would prove what Xavier had just done to himself. "I can't fix your arrogance, Xavier. You destroyed your own company the moment you signed those separation papers without reading them." The silence on the other end was deafening, then barely a whisper. "How much are we talking about?" 42 patents, over $1 billion, all legally transferred to Alexander Stroud as of 10:47 a.m. yesterday. The line went dead. "I'm David Park, and I'm the corporate lawyer who spent 5 years preparing for this exact moment." But this wasn't just about protecting a client. It was about proving that corporate arrogance has consequences. And sometimes those consequences cost everything. 5 years ago, I failed a client named Robert Stevens. He'd been a loyal engineer at a tech startup for 15 years when new investors decided he was too expensive. They fired him on a Friday, claiming budget cuts, then hired 3 younger engineers the following Monday to do his job. Robert came to me after the fact, hoping I could help him fight the wrongful termination. But his contract was standard corporate garbage. No protections, no recourse, nothing. I watched a good man's career get destroyed, while the company profited from his innovations. "I should have seen this coming," I told my mentor after we lost the case. "I should have protected him better." "Next time," she said, "don't just write contracts. Write insurance policies." That failure haunted me. So, when Alexander Stroud walked into my office 3 months later, worried about job security after 20 years with Vertec, I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. "I've seen what happens to loyal employees," Alexander told me. "Companies chew you up and spit you out the moment it's convenient. I need protection." I leaned forward, my voice intense. "Then we're going to build you the most airtight protection clause in corporate legal history. If they ever betray you, it's going to cost them everything." Drafting Clause 17 was like designing a bear trap. It had to be invisible until the moment someone stepped on it. Then it had to be absolutely lethal. I spent weeks researching patent law, looking for precedents where intellectual property rights reverted to original creators. The legal foundation was solid, but the execution had to be flawless. "Here's how this works," I explained to Alexander. "You've personally developed or supervised 42 patents during your tenure. Normally, these belong to the company, but if they terminate you without just cause, all rights automatically revert to you." Alexander's eyes widened. That's nuclear. "Exactly. It's mutually assured destruction. As long as they treat you fairly, nothing happens. But if they betray you," I slid the patent valuation across the desk. "They lose over $1 billion in intellectual property. What if they refuse to sign?" "They won't. I'm burying this 34 pages deep in your renewal contract, surrounded by standard language." Xavier Blackwood has never read a full contract in his life. He just signs whatever legal puts in front of him. The day of the board meeting, I presented Alexander's contract renewal as routine business. Standard employment terms, I told them. Confidentiality agreements, vacation policies, IP acknowledgments. Xavier barely glanced at the documents. "Whatever keeps our people happy," he said, scrawling his signature with his usual arrogance. "That's what we pay lawyers for, right? To handle the boring details." If he'd bothered to read page 34, he might have survived what was coming. For 5 years, I watched Vertec's culture shift. Xavier brought in younger executives, pushed out veteran employees, and surrounded himself with yes men who told him what he wanted to hear. Alexander kept me updated on every slight, every warning sign, every indication that his time was running out. They hired his daughter Aurora as a strategic consultant, Alexander told me during one of our quarterly check-ins. 24 years old, fresh MBA, never worked anywhere else. She's been sitting in on my meetings, taking notes. My stomach tightened. Sounds like they're preparing to replace you. That's what I'm thinking. She asked me yesterday to walk her through the supply chain management system, like she's studying for my job. I pulled up Clause 17 on my computer, reviewing every word. The protection is still active. If they fire you without cause, the patents transfer automatically. What happens then? Then we find out if Xavier Blackwood is as stupid as I think he is. 3 weeks later, Alexander called with the news I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. Xavier wants to discuss structural changes to optimize our human capital deployment. Corporate speak for, "You're fired. Are you ready for this?" I asked. I've been ready for 5 years. The call came at 10:52 a.m. It's done. Alexander's voice was steady, but I could hear the controlled anger beneath it. 25 years of my life, dismissed like I was some broken piece of equipment. My heart was pounding. What exactly did Xavier say? He called it a strategic restructuring. Said Aurora would be taking over my responsibilities because they needed fresh perspectives and digital native thinking. And then he slid the separation papers across the table and told me to sign. And you signed? I signed. But David, I watched Xavier sign those papers too. He didn't even read them. Just scratched his signature like he was autographing a baseball. The moment Alexander said those words, I knew Clause 17 had detonated. Xavier's signature on those separation papers, combined with the complete lack of just cause, had triggered the automatic patent transfer. In the span of 30 seconds, Xavier had signed away over $1 billion in intellectual property. Alexander, I said, my voice barely controlled, you need to understand what just happened. I got fired. I understand perfectly. Number. You just became the legal owner of 42 patents worth over $1 billion. Xavier's signature activated the reversion clause. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. You're serious. Dead serious. Those patents are yours now. Legally, automatically, irrevocably yours. The first domino fell at 3:17 p.m. My assistant burst into my office without knocking. Mr. Park, we're getting calls from Vertex International Partners. Their licensing systems are showing errors. They're saying the patents are invalid. I smiled for the first time all day. Check the patent database. Look up the ownership records for Vertex IP portfolio. She pulled up the system on her laptop. Then her face went white. They all show Alexander Stroud as the owner. All 42 patents. Not an error. That's Clause 17 working exactly as designed. By 4 p.m., my phone was ringing nonstop. Vertex junior lawyers, their business development team, even their international partners, all trying to understand why their entire IP portfolio had just vanished. At 4:23 p.m., my phone rang with Xavier's personal number. David. His voice was tight, controlled, dangerous. We need to talk. I'm listening. My legal team is telling me that somehow Alexander Stroud now owns our patents. This is impossible. Actually, it's inevitable. You terminated him without cause and signed the separation papers. Clause 17 activated automatically. Clause what? I don't know what you're talking about. Page 34 of Alexander's employment contract. The one you signed 5 years ago without reading. I could hear papers rustling frantically in the background. This is extortion. This is fraud. I'll sue you both into oblivion. Xavier, my voice was ice cold now. You signed the contract. You fired Alexander without cause. You signed the separation papers. There is nothing fraudulent about you being held accountable for your own signatures. But those patents are worth over $1 billion. Yes, I know. I valued them when I wrote the clause. The silence that followed was the sound of a man realizing he'd just destroyed everything he'd worked for with his own careless arrogance. The emergency board meeting was called for 8 a.m. the next morning. Xavier demanded I attend to explain this legal disaster. I walked into that boardroom like a gunslinger entering a saloon. Every eye was on me, but instead of fear, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Robert Stevens's case. Complete professional vindication. Gentlemen, Xavier began, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. Mister, Park has somehow engineered a legal catastrophe that has cost this company over $1 billion in intellectual property. Board chair. Margaret Chen looked at me with steel in her eyes. Is this true, David? I opened my briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. What's true is that 5 years ago, this board approved Alexander Stroud's employment contract, a contract that included protective clauses in the event of wrongful termination. We never approved anything like that, Xavier shouted. I slid copies of the meeting minutes across the table. June 15th, 5 years ago. I presented Alexander's contract as part of routine employment business. You all voted to approve it. Margaret scanned the documents, her expression growing grimmer by the second. It says here you explained the contract included standard IP acknowledgments and employee protections. That's exactly what I said. Clause 17 is an employee protection. It protects valuable employees from being wrongfully terminated. Xavier slammed his hand on the table. This is semantic games. You hid this clause. I hid nothing. It's on page 34, written in plain English. The problem isn't that it was hidden. The problem is that you never read what you signed. I stood up, my voice filling the room. For 5 years, this clause sat dormant. Alexander never wanted to use it. He hoped his loyalty and expertise would be enough. But yesterday, you fired the most valuable employee this company has ever had, for no reason other than wanting to install your unqualified daughter in his position. Aurora is perfectly qualified. Aurora confused cloud storage with server architecture in her first meeting. She suggested uploading patents to the blockchain to protect them. She's a 24-year-old MBA with zero technical experience, and you put her in charge of $1 billion supply chain. The board members were exchanging glances now, the reality of Xavier's incompetence becoming undeniable. The clause activated because you breached your duty to this company, I continued. You fired your most valuable asset and replaced him with nepotism. Alexander Stroud built the systems that generated those patents. If you don't want him working here, why should you benefit from his innovations? Margaret looked at Xavier with undisguised disgust. You did this to us. Your arrogance cost us everything. The clause is legally binding, I finished. Xavier signed it 5 years ago, and he triggered it yesterday. There is no legal recourse, no appeal, no way to undo this. Those patents belong to Alexander Stroud now. Xavier's face had gone completely white. For the first time in his corporate career, his arrogance had consequences he couldn't charm or intimidate his way out of. Within 72 hours of Vertex collapse, the business world was experiencing something unprecedented. A single contract clause had triggered industry-wide panic about legal vulnerabilities that corporate executives had never considered. The Harvard Business School called it the Stroud shock, the sudden realization that employment contracts might contain hidden weapons, capable of destroying billion-dollar companies overnight. Within a week, 3 major law firms had launched contract vulnerability audits, charging Fortune 500 companies 6-figure fees to review their employment agreements for similar time bombs. We're getting 50 calls a day from panicked executives, reported Patricia Williams during our ABA committee call. They're demanding emergency reviews of every employment contract they have signed in the past decade. The corporate world is terrified that they have unknowingly signed away their company's most valuable assets. The fear was justified. My Stroud standard had inspired a new generation of employment lawyers to embed similar protective mechanisms in their clients' contracts. Within 6 months, reports surfaced of at least 12 major corporations discovering reversion clauses in their senior employees' agreements, clauses that had been sitting dormant for years, waiting to be triggered by corporate betrayal. Tech giant Meridian Systems found 17 patent reversion clauses in their senior engineering contracts. Pharmaceutical company Biogen discovered that their chief research scientist owned the rights to $800 million in drug patents if he was ever terminated without cause. The automotive industry went into collective panic when Ford's review revealed similar clauses protecting their electric vehicle technology developers. The Vertec case has fundamentally changed the power dynamic between corporations and their most valuable employees, wrote business analyst Jennifer Martinez in the Wall Street Journal. Suddenly, loyalty isn't just an emotional concept. It's a financial imperative. Companies can no longer casually discard experienced professionals without facing potentially catastrophic consequences. The media coverage was unprecedented. Forbes published a cover story titled, "The Lawyer Who Taught Corporate America to Fear Contracts." Businessweek ran a 3-part series analyzing the legal and psychological strategies that had brought down Xavier Blackwood. Even 60 Minutes aired a segment called The $1 Billion Clause that featured interviews with international partners who had watched Vertec's empire crumble in real time. But the most satisfying recognition came from an unexpected source. Robert Stevens, the client I had failed 5 years earlier, called me 2 months after the Vertec story broke. "I saw the Harvard Business Review article," he said, his voice carrying a satisfaction I hadn't heard since before his own corporate betrayal. "I know this doesn't bring back my 15 years, but watching you outmaneuver Xavier Blackwood felt like justice for all of us who got discarded by corporate arrogance." "That's exactly what it was supposed to be, Robert. I couldn't save your career, but maybe I prevented this from happening to others. You did more than that. You proved that intelligence and preparation can beat corporate power and arrogance. That matters to people like me. That matters to everyone who's ever been told they're too expensive or too old or no longer aligned with company vision." Well, within 6 months, my practice had transformed completely. I was no longer just writing employment contracts. I was designing comprehensive protection systems for high-value employees across multiple industries. Senior engineers, research scientists, creative directors, and other professionals whose innovations generated massive value for their employers began seeking what the media dubbed Stroud protection. Each case required the same strategic thinking that had made Clause 17 successful: legal precision, psychological insight, and long-term strategic planning. I found myself essentially reverse engineering corporate behavior and designing legal countermeasures customized to each company's culture and leadership psychology. The intellectual challenge was immense and deeply satisfying. A biotech researcher needed protection from acquisition-hungry pharmaceutical companies. A senior software architect wanted security against age discrimination in Silicon Valley's youth-obsessed culture. A creative director required shields against the advertising industry's notorious instability. Each protection system had to be invisible until activated, legally unbreakable once triggered, and psychologically designed to exploit the specific weaknesses of corporate leadership. I wasn't just practicing law. I was practicing strategic psychology, using legal mechanisms to enforce ethical behavior in corporate environments that had forgotten the value of loyalty. The financial transformation was remarkable as well. Companies began paying premium fees for legal vulnerability assessments to ensure their contracts didn't contain similar weapons. But more importantly, high-value employees were willing to invest substantial sums in protective legal architecture that could secure their careers and innovations. I hired 3 additional attorneys specializing in employment protection law. We developed standardized assessment tools, customizable protection clauses, and implementation strategies that could be adapted across industries. What had started as a personal quest for justice had become a systematic approach to corporate accountability. 6 months later, Alexander called with an update that validated everything I'd hoped to achieve through the Vertec case. The international conglomerate just offered me a permanent position as Global Innovation Director, he said. They want me to oversee patent development across 12 international markets. The salary is 4 times what Vertec was paying me. How does it feel to have your expertise properly valued? Like intellectual vindication. But David, the real impact is broader. 3 other companies have reached out, all emphasizing their commitment to respecting senior talent. Word has spread through the industry that loyalty needs to flow both directions. What kind of changes are you seeing? Companies are actually reading employment contracts now. They're asking detailed questions about protection clauses. They're implementing policies to prevent wrongful termination. The Vertec collapse sent a message throughout the corporate world that treating experienced professionals as disposable assets has consequences. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Xavier's attempt to replace experience with nepotism had created industry-wide awareness of the value of senior expertise. His failure had become a cautionary tale that was reshaping corporate behavior across multiple sectors. "You didn't just protect me," Alexander continued. "You proved that strategic thinking and careful preparation can defeat corporate arrogance. That's a lesson every executive in America needed to learn, and you taught it in the most effective way possible, through consequences they couldn't ignore." The transformation extended beyond individual cases. Law schools began teaching courses on defensive employment law. Bar associations offered continuing education seminars on employee protection strategies. Corporate legal departments started hiring specialists in loyalty retention law, a field that barely existed before the Vertec case. Most importantly, the balance of power in corporate relationships had shifted measurably. Experienced professionals no longer approached employment negotiations as supplicants hoping for corporate mercy. They came prepared with legal protection, strategic thinking, and the knowledge that their expertise had value that extended beyond their current employer's convenience. The gray wolves of the corporate world had learned something the young alphas forgot. Experience isn't just valuable, it's irreplaceable. And when you try to replace the irreplaceable, sometimes the very contracts you signed come back to teach you that lesson in the most expensive way possible. 3 weeks after the collapse, Alexander called with an update that filled me with professional pride. "David, I just signed the consulting agreement. Global Innovation Advisor, overseeing patent development across 6 industries. They're treating me like the expert I always was. And the patents, I'm licensing some to companies that actually value their employees. The others I'm developing through my own firm. Turns out, when you own billion-dollar IP, people return your calls." I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. How does it feel to have your worth recognized? Like justice. But David, I need you to know something. This wasn't just about the money or the patents. This was about proving that experience and loyalty have value, that you can't just discard people who built your empire. That's exactly what I hoped would happen when I wrote that clause. "You didn't just protect me," Alexander said. "You proved that corporate arrogance has consequences." 6 months later, I received a call from a business journalist investigating the Vertec collapse. She wanted to understand how one contract clause had brought down $1 billion company. "Was this revenge?" she asked. "No," I told her. "This was justice. I wrote that clause as protection, not as a weapon. But when corporations betray loyal employees, they deserve to face the consequences of their actions." "Do you regret the outcome?" I thought about Robert Stevens, the client I'd failed to protect. I thought about Alexander, now thriving and respected. I thought about Xavier, whose arrogance had cost hundreds of people their jobs. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret holding powerful people accountable for their signatures. The truth is, every contract I write now includes similar protective clauses, not because I want to destroy companies, but because employees deserve security. They deserve protection from the casual cruelty of corporate restructuring. Xavier never read Clause 17. He signed away $1 billion because he was too arrogant to read what he was putting his name to. That's not my fault, that's his. And when his lawyers called me at 2 a.m., screaming about legal disasters and ruined careers, I felt something I hadn't experienced since law school: complete professional satisfaction. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply being prepared for the moment when arrogance meets consequences. The gray wolves of the corporate world know something the young alphas forget. Contracts aren't just pieces of paper. They're promises. And when you break those promises, sometimes the very documents you signed come back to destroy you. If you enjoyed this story about strategic justice and legal brilliance, please like this video and let me know in the comments what you thought. If this story resonates with you, remember, read what you sign, respect what you've built, and never underestimate the power of a lawyer who truly protects their clients. Because the next time you're tempted to sign something without reading it, remember Xavier Blackwood. Remember the man who destroyed a billion-dollar empire with one careless signature. And remember that somewhere out there, lawyers like me are writing clauses that will hold you accountable for every word you agree to.